Dear colleagues, thank you very much, Christine and Hervé and team, for inviting me for this particular session. I hope your drops workshop is going well, and I'm sorry that me or the team members could not be there in person, but hoping that this video presentation can make up a bit for it. It is Friday evening in New York, and I'm hoping that this recording goes as smoothly as possible, and that you don't mind if from time to time I may be referring to my notes. So the presentation for this session is divided in two parts. In the first part, I will speak very briefly on how the UN coherence landscape is evolving here in New York. And the second part of the presentation, which is the bulk of it, will focus on how we are approaching the implementation of the standard operating procedures for delivering as one countries at the country level. But just before I move on with the slides, at the very onset to say that in New York, here in headquarters, what we are noting from all our engagement with member states, that there is a very strong increasing demand for UN coherence and for UNICEF to work together with other UN agencies. And this is really the reality before us, which I'm sure that you are feeling in many ways at the regional and more importantly at the country level. The message I have from the Public Partnerships Division and from our team here is that how do we make sure that UN coherence works for UNICEF in a way that it helps us to achieve better results for kids on the ground. And I think that is really the objective. It's both, it can be sometimes challenging, but equally it is an opportunity for us, particularly at the field. So on that note, I'm going to start. This is the good part of the video presentation is I'm not there, so you could stop me at any point that you feel it's getting boring or that it is not relevant for you. So I'm going to move on now to slide 2. And here what I have laid out for you is big picture. As you know that the new agenda post-2015 is shaping up and we have several interdependent tracks. We've highlighted for you in the slide 5 tracks, the first being the SDGs themselves with the summit scheduled for September. The second being the financing for development in Addis, which is coming up in a couple of months, which will hopefully look at how we can translate the aspirational goals into action in terms of financing. The third is more around humanitarian issues and disaster risk reduction. We of course had Sendai and we will have the World Humanitarian Summit next year. And then the fourth is the climate change, which is coming up in Paris in December. And the fifth parallel track that is going on is the UN Fit for Purpose reform dialogue among member states. In simple terms, what this means is that member states have started a conversation about how can the UN system adapt itself to deliver on the new agenda. In fact, some of them have gone pretty far ahead and have started thinking through how can the UN system be restructured or redesigned to better deliver on the SDGs. Moving on to the next slide, here again, very quickly, on the left side of the box, we've shown what member states are really discussing, as I just mentioned, along with the substance of the SDGs. They are moving into the how to implement, as well as the how in terms of the longer term positioning of the UN, i.e. the fit for purpose. That's the third bullet on the left. And this will eventually culminate in the new QCPR. And the dialogues currently currently among member states are focusing on a range of topics, from funding to capacity to organizational arrangements, that's business models, as well as governance reform. And of course, this process is not without its challenges. As you can imagine, it is politically very intense. There are big differences, especially among the traditional donors and the group of 77, around some sensitive issues relating to critical mass of core resources, as well as governance, for example, whether to continue with the boards of the funds and programs or whether to possibly look at a merger of boards and what have you. On the right side, how is the UN system responding? The Chief Executive's Board and all its pillars, including the UN Development Group, which many of you would be familiar with, are trying to engage with member states on this debate and dialogue. And what is important, as you can see on the right side, the last point, which is that the UNDG in particular is accelerating the implementation of the standard operating procedures, or SOPs, at the country level as a way to demonstrate to member states that yes, we are becoming fit for purpose. So moving on to the next slide, what does this fit for purpose actually mean? In the words of our executive director, the purpose in the fit for purpose is results for kids. And that is what matters at the end of the day. We've tried to unpack this fit for purpose jargon into some concrete system-wide actions that UNICEF is advocating for, and these are listed on the slide. I won't go through all of them, but just to highlight, for example, at the country level, we see UNICEF and the UN country teams working very closely with national governments to develop SDG-based national implementation, monitoring, and budgetary frameworks. Similarly, SDG-based UNDAFs in support of national frameworks. And then, as you can see to your right side, actions ranging from multi-stakeholder partnerships to having even more women from the South represented in leadership positions at the UN country team level, to the last point, number 10 on fit for purpose, is to implement the standard operating procedures itself and apply the good coherence principles that are embedded in the SOPs as widely as possible. So moving on to the fifth slide, this is with request to Hervé and our colleagues in the workshop to kindly play this 2.5 minutes video from our executive director, who has very well explained the essence of the standard operating procedures and the importance of keeping a results focus at the country level. So you've now hopefully heard what our executive director has said. So let me now move on to the second part of the presentation, delving a bit more into the standard operating procedures for delivering as one, which I understand from Hervé and Christine is also the specific focus of this session. Now, just taking a step back, delivering as one, member states believe that it is the way forward and there is no returning back to business as usual. So DAO has heavy political weight behind it. Now, what you see on your right side, if you're not already familiar, is the standard operating procedures package that was released officially by the Secretary General last year in September. It is a comprehensive package which also includes a number of practical tools and guidelines to help you further to implement the SOPs. 4 points here on this slide. The first one to the left is that the SOPs is basically a response to the QCPR. And the QCPR, of course, as many of you know, is binding on UNICEF as a fund and is binding on the funds and programs, which is why we take it so seriously. And the SOPs is a response to the QCPR. In very simple terms, it is outlining the what and the how to implement the delivering as one in terms of its 5 pillars of one program, one leader, communicating as one budgetary framework, and operating as one. The second point here in this slide is that the standard operating procedures cannot be implemented in a mechanical fashion. They do need to be adapted to the country context and needs. So flexibility is key. The third point, that in order to support the implementation of the SOPs at the country level, UNDG here at the global level has approved a headquarters plan of action which aims to address some of the systemic bottlenecks and challenges that come in the way of smooth implementation. This is, of course, work in progress. The final important point is that as UNICEF, we do believe that the standard operating procedures embody some good principles of working together, good principles of UN coherence, which can be applied in perhaps all contexts, regardless of whether a country is officially designated as delivering as one or not. So zooming in on what are these good coherence principles or practices of working together, this is how we see it at UNICEF, and we have been advocating for a range of these principles which are highlighted in front of you on slide 7. They range from developing light and strategic UNDAFs to a big focus on joint programming, which is very much encouraged because it helps to foster a coordinated approach in delivering results and helps to remove duplication of efforts. From these kinds of principles to what you can see in the end, the 7th principle is about investing in common services where it makes sense and where there are efficiency gains and savings. Moving on in this next slide, on slide 8, what we have simply done is we've mapped against the 5 pillars of delivering as one, that is on the left side. We've mapped the good coherence principles that UNICEF is advocating. So say, for example, against the one program, you have the light and strategic UNDAF at the outcome level. Against the communicating as one, it clarifies as a good coherence principle that the best placed UNCT agency speaks on the relevant issues that come up in the country context. Now I'm going to here on delve into each of these 5 standard operating procedures, and what I have highlighted in the slides is some data that is relevant for the WCARO, for the countries in the WCARO region, and this is based on an analysis done by my team of the country office annual reports of 2014. So you have the evidence to speak to each of the SOPs. So I'll be moving through this quite rapidly, but the data is there for your reference. So the first SOP on one program, as our executive director has said, is we need to consciously work towards moving from process to results, and we can do this in very many ways as it is highlighted in the slide according to the SOPs. First is looking at lighter and strategic UNDAFs. We understand that in the WCARO region, 5 countries signed off on the UNDAFs, but they were still at the output level. We're hoping that in future the UNDAFs are pitched at a higher level wherever possible. The second, as our ED mentioned, about what we consider as a good practice, which is interagency results groups, which helps us to bring the complementarity of different agencies together and promotes joint programming. The good news from the region is UNICEF was involved in almost close to 130 results groups in around 24 countries, and we did lead in or co-lead in almost 55 countries, and including in a range of topics such as education, social protection, and what have you. As we move down the other features of the one program, just to note that joint work plans should be pursued wherever they are feasible. They are definitely not mandatory, and this is important. It cannot happen at the expense of efficiency and effectiveness. The Joint National UN Steering Committee is an important feature of the one program. That said, we need to make sure that the UN country team keeps the role of this committee pitched at a higher level as that of strategic oversight, rather than getting the committee involved in micromanagement and allocation of funds. And finally, about the UN country results reports, which many UN country teams are already aiming for. These, however, do not replace agency-specific country annual reports, which are, as you know, an executive board requirement. And we do encourage that UNICEF, wherever possible, is taking a leadership role on interagency results groups in areas of our comparative advantage. Now moving on to the second standard operating procedure, and now just to make sure, I am on slide 10. And this one, the Common Budgetary Framework, is a good practice, and it is, simply put, it is an Excel sheet which pulls together the expected and available resources from the different members of the UN country team. Wherever possible, the UN country teams can develop joint resource mobilization strategies, but just to note that these do not replace or should not compromise on agency-specific fundraising strategies. And one fund, wherever donors are willing to use this mechanism, and we need to make sure that there is very clear objective criteria to guide the allocation of the one fund. And as you can see, the picture in the WCARO region is we have two countries that have one funds, Cape Verde and Sierra Leone. And in 2013, we had almost 6 countries who were practicing the Common Budgetary Framework. That said, the one fund as a mechanism is dwindling. It's getting less popular because less and less donors are putting in money. And this is something we have raised here at New York level. On funding, just to mention that globally, the picture from 2014 is quite encouraging on joint programs. UNICEF is actively engaging in joint programs across the regions. As you can see in this chart, we have almost close to 80 countries who are engaging in over 180 joint programs. And for the WCARO region, 16 out of 24 of your country offices have reported implementing joint programs. That said, we do recognize some of the challenges. Donors here in New York are demanding more joint funding going forward in the post-2015. And we are also trying to resolve some of the challenges around, for example, the issue of cost recovery. This does require coherent and consistent behavior among donors, as well as consistent behavior among the relevant UN country team members or the UNDG agencies. We're trying to address some of these challenges here at headquarters level. So moving on to slide number 12. So this is now the operating as one, and here just to mention that we do have the business operations strategy that some of you are familiar with, and this is a voluntary strategy that has been introduced by the UNDG, and simply put, it is a strategy that goes in parallel to the UNDAF and covers a range of common service areas from procurement through finance to common premises and audit. Currently, the UNDG is piloting this in 14 countries. What is very important to note is that an assessment is underway of these pilots, and before any scaling up or global rollout is considered, we need the evidence on how well this strategy is working and whether it is leading to cost savings and efficiency gains or not. So we're hoping that the assessment will be done and the findings will be available in a couple of months' time. The second point here is an important one, that globally UNICEF has been actively participating in common services, whether it is through long-term agreements or harmonized approaches in HR recruitment processes and what have you. And this is an important point because member states sometimes get very stuck with BOS, and we're trying to shift their attention to look at operating as one beyond BOS, to show that we are indeed globally actively engaged in harmonized approaches to common services, as I'm sure is happening in many countries in your region. In fact, in your region, 20 country offices have reported as actively participating in common services, with 14 of them are also pursuing long-term agreements. What is important here to remember is that donors are demanding more and more harmonization and simplification of business practices. They also want more shared service centers, and our big picture message to donors has been, we're willing to do all of this provided we have evidence that it is leading to better program delivery and to better results. So efficiency gains and cost savings, and it should not be harmonization for the sake of harmonization. Moving on to the fourth SOP, which is the one leader, which I'm sure resonates with many of you. You're familiar perhaps with what the QCPR says. It is important here just to mention that we do need to make sure that we fully implement the management and accountability framework, which many of you should be knowing about, which includes the functional firewall between the resident coordinator and the UNDP resident representative. We're also under one leader, we are working towards sharing the costs of the RC system along 10 coordination functions. But the important point in one leader where the SOP makes a breakthrough is that it looks at a one leader as the entire UN country team. So the one leader is not just the RC, it is an empowered UN country team and the resident coordinator. And I'd like you to remember that point. Of course, we've had a lot of recently approved guidances from the UNDG in terms of a revised job description for RCs, as well as a revised guidance note on UNCT working arrangements and code of conduct, for those of you who are not familiar with it. Now, continuing with the theme of the one leader, this is some of the data from the WCARO region from 2014 country office annual reports. As you can see that we have looked at what the trend is in the responses from your reps and from UNICEF offices. And what we see overall in your region, that 95% of your country offices have indicated that the RC consults the UNCT when taking decisions. So that is a marked improvement from before. That said, there are obvious areas for improvement. And for example, if you look at the second set of charts in this slide, it shows that in 2014, there are 9 country offices who perceive that the RC does not refrain from fundraising for UNDP. And this figure has gone up as against 3 country offices in 2013. So it's from 3 to 9, so which means that more efforts are needed to implement the firewall function and to make sure that the management and accountability framework is fully implemented. That said, what is important is that our reps, country reps, do encourage and follow up to make sure that RCs are able to provide feedback in their respective PERs. UNICEF has committed to this mutual accountability, and we see that there is still room for improvement in the WCARO region when it comes to this particular aspect of the PERs of reps and getting feedback from RCs. The final SOP is on real one, because here the picture overall is quite positive, As we can see that 21 of your country offices have a joint UN country team communications strategy. What is important here to note is that this joint communications strategy should not replace the agency-specific communication strategy. Neither should it compromise on UNICEF's visibility and branding. I understand this is a delicate balance, but it can be handled and should be handled. Many country offices have also established country communications groups, which are chaired at the head of agency level. Wherever possible, UNICEF can be in the lead. What is important is that the UN country team speaks with one voice on key issues of common concern. That said, what the SOP is very clear that the RC is not the only one voice. The best place UN country team agency speaks on a particular issue or does the messaging on a particular area of concern. So when it comes to kids, then it is UNICEF, and that should be the understanding. Lastly, just to conclude, and I'm hoping that I have stuck to my time limit, just to sum up a couple of key messages that delivering as one is important for UNICEF, provided we shift the focus from process to results, as has been reinforced by our executive director. Equally, secondly, we believe that it is good, it makes sense in most contexts or depends on the country context and the country needs. What is really important is we find ways of working together but do not lose UNICEF or results for kids in the process. Third, as I have explained, to sum up, the SOPs do offer some good coherence principles which can help us to keep our results focused, but the application of SOPs and of the good coherence principles again remains flexible. And finally, the bottom line is this is not rocket science, that we be as smart and strategic as possible, implement it both from a political lens as well as a practical lens. I know it's easier said than done, but it is not impossible, and that we make sure ultimately that all this UN coherence delivering as one good coherence principles ultimately helps us to maximize results for kids. And on that note, I will stop, and I look forward to engaging with all of you in the plenary.